Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page and I'm your host. Thank you for tuning in. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're choosing to spend your time with us. Today we have a special guest. His name is Steve Primas. Steve is the social worker at SOTA. We had a conversation talking about engaging our community, about the importance of social emotional learning and family engagement, and how students have to be well in order to gauge the community well. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Steve.
Our school, we really believe in relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartedly believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time.
The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent. Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. I'm Christian Page. I'm your host. You all know my partner in crime, Zach Varnell. And today we have, normally I say like a special guest, but I got to say special 2 times. We have a special guest who's joining us today. It's Mr. Steve Primas. I have known, I still can't call you Steve. It just doesn't work. I've known Mr. P for a good portion of my life. I went to middle school with his daughter. Mm-hmm. We have since found ourselves in professional spaces together. And it's an honor, right, to have you here hanging out with us. For the folks who have not gotten the chance to meet you, for people who may not be extremely familiar with you, tell us about your role being a social worker here in the Element Schools, and tell us about how you landed here at SOTA, right? There's a lot of paths that could lead you other places, and somehow you found yourself in this direction. So who are you? How did you get here?
All right. Good morning. And it's an honor to be here with Christian. Do amazing work, and I'm very proud of you. I just want to say that publicly. But I would say, again, my role here as a social worker is, really to support the social emotional issues that students have, support them, support the teachers, also help guide, because it's teachers, right? They go to school and learning about teaching, but rarely do they talk about social emotional and how to handle those things and how to support students in that regard. Because sometimes, the way the way we say things sometimes can have a different effect. It can land differently for different students. And sometimes we not knowing that, and sometimes also not having the background of what our students are going through. So that's my role, is to support that from the social emotional aspect, because a lot of our students, real life is happening to them as they're trying to get an education, right? Like, it is hard to come to school and focus on science or focus on history when things are crumbling at home. Or all kind of atrocities are happening around me. And so, how do I deal with that? And how do I deal with life on life's terms? So that's one of the ways that I help our students here. Also do family engagement with our families and try to keep our families involved, right? Because at the elementary school level, middle school level, parents can easily be in the schools to help out. When they get to high school, it's like, I got to be hands off because my kids don't want me around. Yeah. And so my vision is family engagement. This is a way to keep parents in the know, keep them still involved, because we still need that partnership with parents. Because again, if we can't access the parents, because the whole village approach, we need both, right? Like, teachers only had the kids for a certain amount of time, parents have them for a certain amount of time, and we need to be that bridge to build that partnership. So again, that's my role here. Now, how did I get here? So I used to do a lot of at-risk youth work, right? So I used to work with kids in Raymond Hall. I used to work in Raymond Hall. I used to work in probation. I used to work in detention. And so I saw kids, at the lowest point in their lives oftentimes, right? They are incarcerated for something. But oftentimes I knew that was usually birthed out of some sort of trauma, how they ended up in those spaces. I worked for child welfare for many years. Most people will know it as CPS, right? So I did a lot of foster care social work, getting kids reunified with families, sometimes having to get them placed with other families or even adopted out. And so I did that work, and then I went to work for the Office of Juvenile Justice in Olympia, where my job was I was a state compliance monitor. So I had to monitor all police stations and jails and juvenile facilities, making sure we're keeping kids out of adult systems, right? But with all that, the common theme I saw was I was doing intervention work, right? I was doing work after something drastic has already happened in these kids' lives. And that's what led me to the school system. I wanted to be on the prevention side, right? If I can help prevent these kids from touching those systems, then that would be a great perk. And so that's what led me to the school district, and specifically here to SOTA. And so I love SOTA because it's an opportunity, and I often say this, kids get a college experience in high school. Right? We're not in a traditional building. We're spread out throughout downtown area. And so it does take a certain discipline for students to get to class, right? It does take a certain motivation. And so I like that aspect of it. And so that's why I'm here.
That's awesome. And I appreciate the definitions, the distinctions between intervention and prevention work. There's a friend of mine who's an assistant principal in the district as well, and he does a lot of work with the local police enforcement. Basically, he says, right, I got to get to them before they get to you. And so I really appreciate that. And I've known your work for a long time, right? Been a recipient of your work in some stages of my life as well. And I'm grateful that you're here with us. One of the things that I want to talk to you about, one of the things that I want to ask you about, right, is that another distinction is, one of the main focuses of these three schools, one of the focuses of SOTA is really engaging our community. But one of my mentors would tell me like this, right? In order for you to go out and do the work, you have to be willing to do your work, right? And so there's something internal that has to happen. I hear you talking about social emotional learning, be able to manage those things. How does your work prepare students, right, to go out and engage in a community like you're saying, right? This isn't your traditional high school experience. You got to be disciplined. You got to have this. You got to have, right? How does the work that you do with students prepare them to go out and engage a community at large?
Great question. So one is helping students to start to find themselves, right? Again, we're socialized by our parents, typically. We get to the adolescent stage and now kids are finding their own identity. They're searching, they're, trying to navigate life on life's terms. And so again, helping them to identify and start to recognize who they are and what passions they have within inside them. Right? That for me, I'm always trying to tap into a kid's passions. What fuels you? What motivates you? Whether it's video games, whether it's skateboarding, whatever that is for each kid is individual, right? And so we have to address them as individuals and not as a collective, first and foremost. And so to help them to start to see a sense of self and to understand that you have value. Right. One of my things that I always tell students is you have value here. Right. No matter what anyone else has ever told you, I need you to understand that you have value. You add value to this world. This world needs you. You have something that no one else has. And so to get them to start to believe in self, first and foremost, and I always say you're a human being before you're a student. So that means you got to take care of yourself. You got to take care of your mental health. You got to take care of emotional health. You got to take care of all those things. And yes, there's some duality to that, right? Yes, you have to take care of those things, but you also got to get education, right? So how do we do the two things at once? And so helping and making sure that students make their mental health a priority, because again, it is hard to focus on the learning aspect if I'm not well. And so we need to do all the things we can do to help students be well. And so that may be therapy, that may be counseling, that may be connecting them with a mentor, something like that. So again, that students have the resources so that they can feel whole and they can feel like they can contribute and they do add value. So that's one of the areas that I really, stress is, really helping kids to get to their passions, to get to their root of, again, what brings me joy, right? Like that, if you don't have joy, this life is miserable. And so how do we get to that space where, I could wake up in the morning and I look forward to going to school instead of I have to go to school. And so again, I'm always encouraging students. I'm always trying to connect students with something that's going to tap into that passion.
I have a quick question. So one thing I appreciate about you, Steve, is as not just a social worker, but as someone who understands how to look at the world through the lens of a student and see their world. I think as adults, oftentimes we look at kids from our perspective and project our own ideas about identity, about community, about participation, engagement on them that we see instead of thinking about how they see it. And it takes work to be able to shift your thinking to look at the world from a student's lens. And I feel like you do a really good job at seeing that. We don't have counselors at our schools. And the reason we don't, if you look at like the funding model from, a state perspective, is counselors in schools are funded at, I think it's like 380 to 1. So the ratio is just absurd. Like, how could you build a relationship and get to know and counsel a student when you're seeing 380 a year? But really the role of counselors in most high schools is around a little bit of post-high planning, schedule planning, scheduling students. There's a lot of technical work. So we don't put that on our social workers. We hire social workers because we want someone in the building to be able to see the complex systems that students are involved in the world when they come to school, to be able to look outside of that. Because it's really hard as a teacher or a mentor or an administrator to see the navigating systems that students are engaged in and how they go about their day. So I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit about those systems that you see. Like, we've already brought up a couple. Like, there's the law enforcement system that students sometimes interact with. There's family and church systems, right? Kids go home and they're a part of a family, which is one system. Maybe they're a part of, like a church community or a faith community. Maybe they're a part of a sports team, and then they come to school and they're a part of social groups, and all these circles are overlapping in a kid's life. And so from their perspective, they're looking at all these systems and navigating in and out of those communities constantly and thinking about where do I get my identity from? Like, when I'm at school, am I thinking about my role as a member of my family or a member of my faith community or a member of the sports team? But then thinking bigger, there's also these macro level systems. Like you mentioned, kids into skateboarding, right? That has a whole subculture that adds to their identity, and they belong to that system. It's much less defined often, less, intentional, but it's still there and affecting the way they think. So I'm wondering if you could maybe just talk about your role as a social worker, how you help kids navigate all of these systems in their life that they're involved with.
Yes. So, when you talk about, so empathy is one of our pillars as well, right?
Yeah.
And empathy for me is the ability to try to put yourself in another person's shoes and see things from their lens, their worldview, their experiences. Now, granted, we will never fully be able to do that, right?
Right.
But to the degree that you're willing to listen and really learn from an individual, can you try to put yourself and understand life from their experiences? And I think it's so important that we do more listening than we do talking. Right. Yeah. And so for me, I always want to hear from students. I always want to hear about your experiences. I want to hear what you're into, what things motivate you, what traumas you've had, what experiences you've had, because now we can connect, right? Because on a human level, we've all experienced hurt. We've all experienced pain. We've all experienced happiness. We've all experienced joy. So, there we can connect there. I may not share the same experience you have, but I share the same emotions.
Yeah.
Right. And at that level, we can connect. And now we bridge the gap. Now we can start to talk and we can start to process through, how do I show up here? What is my role here? What kind of value can I add to this community? And that's the thing, we're in community with each other, right? Every day we're in community with each other. We need each other in order to be safe.
Yeah.
And so with that and understanding being in community with each other is I have a role and I have an importance to show up, because if I don't show up, and I look at education from this aspect, right? I often say education is like this. Imagine if we all had $5 in our pocket. Now in 2023, with $5, you can't get much, right? But if we all pool our $5 together collectively, we can get a lot more than what each individual can get. And so in the collective space of education, right? Like the education world is, if I don't show up, I'm cheating you all out of my $5.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so it's important that I show up because I want to contribute, because I want us collectively all to win. And so that's the aspect that I try to get our kids to see it from, is because you add value, because the experiences you have, someone else don't have those experiences. And you are teaching, and just as students are teachers as well.
Right.
Right. Like as teachers, we should be teachers and educators. We should be learning from our students, because again, they have life experiences that we don't have.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able, and we have to understand with education, those life experiences is just as valuable as the book stuff. Right. Like some things can't be taught out of a book.
Yeah.
And so having real world life experience, family traumas that you are going through that you can process and that you can channel, or successes or failures that you've had on a sports team, right? Understanding how to relate those to education or a group project. And so all those things are relatable. And so really helping kids to understand that we're all in community with each other and we need each other.
Yeah, and I so appreciate what you're saying, because I think oftentimes we think about education, especially once you get, probably not so much in like elementary school, by the time you get to high school, it becomes very consumer oriented. Like my goal is to come to school, take my classes, get the highest grade I can on a test, get what I need from it and leave, not participate in a community where I'm bringing my $5 to the table just like everyone else so that we can have a collective pool and build something great together. And I don't think we talk enough in education about the power of teaching kids how to do that. But it takes work, because kids are not used to participating in that. And when we're talking about engaging your community, there's kind of a spectrum. Like we want students to enter in at this level, just you got to show up. Which we should talk about. Like that in and of itself is a challenge. There are a handful of kids, we talk about it with our care teams, that just showing up to school and being present is a challenge in their life because of all the inequities and systems in their lives that prevent them from doing that. But then once you get to school, there's this whole spectrum of engaging where it's not just showing up, it's participating. It's not just participating, it's looking to use your strengths to bring your $5 to the table. And then beyond that is then how do I use that to help lift up other people and use my strengths to support the rest of the community? And that takes years to develop with kids. And we want them to move through that spectrum from just showing up all the way to using their strengths to support others.
Yes. I often say we have to get away from a compliance system to really educating kids, right? Like and true education is messy.
Yeah.
Right. True education is, you have the ability to question, where did I get my information from? Right. And sometimes that doesn't always feel good.
Right.
From a teacher standpoint, but you have to understand. And so I also look at it from a student aspect as well. Right. Like, if I'm going to come to school and you're going to talk at me, when am I going to ever apply this stuff that you're teaching me? Right. And so oftentimes it's important for us to give them the why behind the what. Right. Like this is a reason why we're teaching this information. Right. This is how it can be utilized. This is, where you may see it later on in life. And so to help give students really an understanding, because again, motivation, we have to help them with the motivation for why learning is important. And so again, like I said, trying to get away from the compliance aspect of teaching kids to just come in, the teacher talks at you, you regurgitate information for a test and those kind of things, right? Like that's a cookie cutter approach to education. And that's what we need to move away from to help students understand, again, where can I use my value? Where can I use my talents? How can I apply my talents to excel this institution of education? How can I use my talents, my strengths? How can I use my life experiences to be seen in the information that we're learning, right? And help others learn. And so as you talk about community, right, and leadership, that's where, again, students get to go out into the community. They get to, in our bridging program, where they get to go out in the community, they get to work in spaces or even see, like I often like to say, get students in areas where they have a passion for. Because oftentimes, I look at, students who go out and get work, right? Like oftentimes students will go out and get work in fast food or whatever. And I'll often ask them, so do you want to be a cook later on? Or like, what's your motivation? You want to be a chef? No, I want to be in computers.
I just want money.
Why are you working in fast food?
Yeah.
So if you want to be in computers, then let's try to get you towards a tech area, right? Like, let's try to get you towards cell phones, towards computers, towards something else. Even if it's volunteering, whatever the case may be, we want to get you the experience of something that you have a passion for, because you may get in there and say, this isn't really what I want to do. I thought it was, right? And so I often say volunteering gives people experience they can't afford to pay for. Yeah. Right. And sometimes that's a good teacher as well. And so we want our students to be out in the community. We want them to be part of the community because, again, we want them to take value and take ownership, because when you are part of a community and when you feel like you belong, it's less likely that you cause harm to the same community you feel a part of.
Absolutely.
Right? Like when we look at crime, people that often commit the crimes, they don't feel part of that community. And so it's easier to cause harm to someone I don't know, as opposed to someone I have a relationship with, someone I have a connection with. And so that's what we're really trying to do, is build those connections. And so that kids feel that they have value, they have input, and that they have ownership. Right? Like we want them to take ownership and not just this is happening to you. We want them to take ownership of their education and their experience.
So I want to go back to one thing you said. I mean, I love that talking about a strengths-based approach, inviting kids into community, saying we're not trying to get to compliance. It's why we don't say a goal of mentor group is attendance, right? Because it's not about being present, having 100% perfect attendance, being marked on time. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is recognizing that you have particular strengths as an individual that we need as a community, and you have value in this community. Question I want to go back to is, that's all good and great. There are tangible and real challenges that some kids face, that even if they want to participate, they want to engage, they want to share their strengths with the community, it prevents them from doing so because of the systems in their life that prevent them. As your job as a social worker, how do you physically see, like tangibly see, even if you have an example of helping students overcome some of those challenges, some of those barriers, to start engaging and moving up that spectrum of engagement where they are seen as a valuable member and their strengths are being used? How do you help them overcome those barriers?
Great question. Yes, because we have some students that unfortunately experience some real grief, some real trauma.
Yeah.
Right. And that may be home trauma. That may be trauma within their families. That may be parents going through a divorce and, there's high conflict there. All these different things that kids have to endure. And so at that point, what they really need mentors. They really need people who believe in them, people who say that I'm going to walk alongside you on this journey. Like you're not alone in this. Because sometimes it can feel like I'm by myself in this world. Right. And oftentimes in those situations, that's exactly how they feel. They feel like I'm alone in this world and I have no one else that I can rely on. I have no one else that believes in me. I have no one else that's checking on me. And so in those situations, like I'm going to be that cheerleader, right? I'm going to say, look, just make it here today. right? Even if you don't make it to every class, I want to see you. Right? Like, I'm looking forward to seeing you. You light up the room, the space that I'm in. And so sometimes just knowing that someone is cheerleading for you like that, having one caring adult. When you talk about trauma, you look at ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, right? And most of us have them. And so for a lot of our kids they're dealing with ACEs on a high level. They're dealing with adverse childhood experiences in real time. And so, but research also shows that it takes one caring adult that can help minimize some of those effects. And so again, that's where mentors get to come into play, right? Like, and that's the reason why we have mentors. And the mentors are supposed to be that individual that is really the initial cheerleader that's saying, hey, I haven't seen you for a week. We really miss you. Right? Like, what can we do to help you? Right? And so, and then beyond the mentors, then they reach out to me and our care team. And our job also is to come along and try to add that same support and say, hey, what do you need? Right? Like, if it's a kid that can't get to school because they have no transportation, okay. Maybe this is a McKinney-Vento situation and we put in that referral. Maybe this is a counseling situation, or maybe your family is going through homelessness and you feel embarrassed about that. And guess what? You don't have to share that with anyone else. You share that with me. And let's see, my job is to go out in the community and find the resources that our kids need. And so again, I'm always looking at how can I be the cheerleader for this kid and what they need right now.
Absolutely. I was thinking, story last spring, we had a intervention meeting with a kid, one of our schools. You look at their attendance record, it's like, wow, they were here the first 3 weeks almost every day. You talk to their mentor. The mentor's like, they were really engaged. They loved being here, really sweet kid. And then they disappeared. They stopped showing up, became like once a week, maybe twice a week. And then we had gone through a stretch where there was like 10 days they weren't here at all. We're like, what's going on? So we finally get a hold of parent. We had to call like 6 numbers on the list to find who would answer. We get the mom to come in. We get the whole story. Turns out this kid lived 10 blocks from the school, so transportation's not an issue. We talked to mom, and she starts to really be open and honest about her story, which took some work to get her to be honest. She actually lives in a trailer in the backyard of the grandparents' house. Kid lives in the house. The mom had lost all educational rights to the kid. She was a drug user. She still lives at home, so she has some some connection with the family. But you talk to the kid, and like, why aren't you coming to school? He's like, well, I just, I wake up and I'm playing video games, and I wish I was at school, but I just start playing games, and the next thing I know, it's 11 o'clock, and then it's kind of too late. And we talk to mom. Well, is there a way you can like remind him to like get up on time and walk to school? And slowly she starts to admit, like, well, I don't know. Sometimes I'm home really late, and I have a hard time getting up in the morning. And you start to look at the world through this kid's lens and realize he has no adult in his life guiding the decisions that he's making. He is looking at his mom and the decisions she's making, living with grandparents who are in their 70s and they're not really capable of getting him to school on time. What are the interventions for a kid like this? It's not that he doesn't want to be at school. Right. He wants to engage. He would rather be at school. He doesn't physically know how to make those decisions on a daily basis to be present. It's like the world is conspiring against him. And so we started to brainstorm, what are some ways that we can put some people in your life? Turns out there's another kid in the neighborhood who lives 5 blocks away. And we find out he's actually in the same mentor group. Is there a way that kid, we can engage him to just stop by your house on his way to school every morning and like say, hey, we can walk to school together? He's like, yeah, I think I could probably do that. And now we start a connection with him and another kid in his mentor group. They start walking to school together. He starts showing up to school. We reach out to mom and say, what can we do to help support you? Like, yes, you've got some significant own challenges in your life, but the ACEs, you're talking about ACEs that are like working to conspire against this kid. The mentor, from their lens, all they know is the kid wasn't showing up anymore. Right. And so they're like, from their perspective, I don't know, the kid just doesn't want to be here. And that's not at all the case. It's all these other systems and forces that are preventing that kid from being successful. And so the work that we have to do as adults is to try to look at the big picture and understand the larger system that is preventing that kid from being successful, and what are the small steps we can take to try to create connection and engage them in different ways.
And that's and that's important. You know, we have to be creative about how we do that, right? Like, again, what's the motivators? Maybe it's another student, right? Because in scenarios like that where kids don't feel like and at times they don't feel their parents value them. Right? Like my parent is supposed to be the one making sure I go to school. My parents are supposed to be. And so when I don't have that, what's my motivation? Right? Like if my superheroes aren't the ones who are encouraging me or telling me to do the right thing, or maybe even they're doing the wrong thing, right? Because I also teach parenting seminars, and I help families also understand that our kids will either one day become us or look for someone like us to marry.
Yeah.
Right? Then on top of that is, so what are we modeling for our kids? Because we have to get away from telling our kids to saying do this, but I'm doing the opposite. Because our kids are going to do the opposite just as we are, right? So the very thing that we're doing, they're going to follow our model. And so I often say we have to learn how to make the shift from power to influence, right? Because the reality is we don't have power over another human being.
Right.
But we do have influence. And if we use our influence right, people won't want to disappoint us. And so in using my influence, oftentimes that's a motivator to help get kids to school because I believe in you, right? Like when they know that you are rocking for them, like you are there for them, it's like, I don't want to let Mr. Primas down. Like if nothing else is going right, like Mr. Primas is beaming when he sees me, I want to keep that going. And so I'm always looking at how can we build strengths? How can we be motivation? How can we be encouraging to those that everything around them is discouraging, right? And so we have to be very creative about that in different ways and different approaches. We have to watch the way that we communicate with students, even when the student hasn't been here. You know, it's important for teachers also to understand, I'm glad you showed up, right? Even that tone will say that I'm not welcome here. Right. So when they do show up, I don't care if they miss, 18 days. Right. Like you should act like you're the happiest. That's the happiest thing of your day to see them. Yeah. Right. Like,
and you got to know the kid because like some of them don't want that much attention, but just the subtle difference. I mean, that is such a subtle art, right?
Yes.
Like you were saying, oh, I'm glad you finally showed up. Versus like, I am so glad you showed up. Right? It's just a little difference of what conversation can change the trajectory of how a kid engages.
Absolutely. Or how can we help you? Or how can we, these 8 assignments that you're missing, right? How can we condense these down to maybe 3 assignments? Or how can we merge some together so you don't feel overwhelmed? Because again, that's a huge part of it as well, right? Like if I'm already behind in my mind, I can never catch up.
Right.
And so we also have to take that into consideration as well. And so sometimes I reach out to teachers and be like, oh, what's the best 2 assignments that they can do to make them so they can get some wins, right? We need them to get some wins under their belt, because if I feel like everything I'm doing is a loss, then why try?
Yeah.
And so I want you to try. And so again, if we can get you that 1 win and build on a 2nd win and keep building on the wins, that's what we have to look and strive to do.
We talked about a lot of heavy stuff. So I'm wondering can you share with us a success story, something that you're really stoked about, a student that you spent time invested in and saw the results, the fruit of that labor really pay off? Oh,
I tell you, a few years ago, I had a student come to me, and she was like, she was about 16, and she was like, me and my dad, we don't have a really good relationship. And so when he doesn't really know me anymore, right? Like I'm 16 now. And when he tries to punish me, like it's hard for me to receive that because we don't really have communication. We don't really talk at home. We're in the same home, but we don't really talk. Right. And so I asked the student, I said, okay, so you would like to build communication with your dad? She was like, yes. I said, okay, so I'm going to give you an exercise and I want you to go home and I want you to try this out. And you're not telling your dad what you're doing, but I want you to tell me something that your dad does well. She said he's a good provider. told me something else. She said, he makes sure that everything in the whole house is taken care of and things like that. So I said, what I want you to do today, I want you to go home and I want you to say, Dad, I appreciate how you provide for us.
Wow.
Right? I said, now, his initial action is probably going to be shocked.
Right. What do you want from me?
And then the first question is going to be, what do you want? Right? Yeah. And I said, you're going to say nothing. I just want you to let you know how much I appreciate you. I said, and then you're going to come back another day or 2 days later, and I want you to appreciate it for something else. And I want you to keep that pattern going. I want you to keep thinking of things. And I want you to write down, and when you're feeling good, I want you to write down all the things you appreciate him for, because you can't do this in a bad moment, because you're not going to you're not going to be able to find anything. So do it when you're feeling good, and you could think of all the things you can appreciate him for, and keep acknowledging those things. I said, now, imagine this. If you continuously do that, what do you think will happen? And she said, he'll probably start doing it back. I said, exactly. I said, normally I teach parents this, but because your parent is not in front of me, I'm going to use you to get to them. Yeah. Right? And she came back about 2 weeks later and she said, it's working. Wow. She's awesome. like we're talking, we're getting along now. We're like enjoying each other. Yeah. I said, there you go.
That's awesome.
I said, what you do, I said, sometimes it takes kids to teach the adults. Yeah. And so you keep modeling that and he will follow your model. It's usually supposed to be reversed, but it can happen. Yeah. Because everybody wants to feel good. Everybody wants to feel needed.
Of course. Yeah.
And one of the things that I really appreciate about you and about this conversation is that this is not just vocal, like you've modeled it throughout. Right. And so like, just dance with me for a quick second. But like, there's an arc, I think, that you've presented, right, in both prevention and intervention. Right. Zach was asking about like, we come to a place where maybe somebody's not here, somebody's not engaged, to the point of like, they now have ownership and they feel valued in the space. And you've talked about this in terms of like bridge and being out in the community, of redirecting folks who are working in fast food to maybe find something in tech, to like, where are your strengths at? And so here's what I'm hearing, right, is if a student feels disengaged, right, there might be a set of strategies that you provide them with, but you also show up as encouragement. I'm glad that you're here, right? Here's some love and support that I can provide you on a human level, on a human connection, right? Like, I'm just really glad that you're present. And I'm glad that you didn't stop here, right? Because this is, and soapbox for a quick second, but I was on a webinar recently, and we were talking about anti-racism, particularly in schools. And, someone had broke out the category of, right, like, and research would tell us if there's one caring adult, in the same way that you did today. It's like, so the thing that you need to do is just tell the kids that you care about them. And I'm like, that's a great start. Right? I'm here for that.
What
that
a novel approach.
Yeah, but it doesn't challenge any of the systems that they have to navigate. It does not give them tools for survival. It does not give them skills that are present there, right? Like, it's a great start, right? But now here's some things to go home and practice, right? Here's some things to make habit. Here's some ways that you can consistently show up. Here are some places where you can utilize your skills in public and have other people believe in you as well. And the last part of this that feels really good, right? Like, is like, I believe in you until it's backwards, right? Until you believe in you, right? Because then now if somebody believes in themselves, they know the skills and stuff they can provide to us, like getting to a space of a sense of belonging and being respected for your passions will have anybody show up day after day. And so like the arc that I'm hearing, right, is from disengagement to being a part of the community, right, is a series of interventions that might show up, all of them centered around like our human connection and essentially like the need to be seen, the need to be loved, the need to have community around me. And from that place, I think students can do anything, right, with the one or two things that they may do well in the world. And I say this vocally because like, I don't know that my ACEs score would be as high as some of the students that I've interacted with or that you've interacted, but like whenever we've talked about adverse childhood experiences, like the opposite is creating positive ones. You know what I mean? And there have been people who have intervened throughout my life. And I think that there are maybe 2 or 3 things that I do really good in the world. But now like I've made a living off of those things, right? I feel community because of those things. There are people who respect me because of those things. And so in the roundabout arc that we're naming here, I I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing, right? For knowing students individually, for showing up and being in their corners, for reaching to families and being that bridge in between. So it doesn't feel like, buzzword in the world right now. It's like, you're indoctrinating my student with all of the, right? But it's an opportunity to be in partnership and to meet the needs, because we know that hand in hand, we're just handing each other off, right? The last thing that I really appreciate is like abandoning this idea of power or certainty to live in a world of uncertainty and influence, right? Like I can push you in but ultimately you're going to be the driver. Right. And so I feel like there's so many special things that you've offered us, that you offer the people who are listening to us, and that you've not only, like, we're not just talking about these things, but things that you've modeled and actually intervened with in our community. So, giving you your flowers, thank you for being here. Thank you for all the things that you're doing. Thank you for sitting down to have a conversation with Zach and I today. And I appreciate you. In a long span of relationship that we've had, but also in the shorter span that you've spent time here. So thank you for having a conversation with us today. Thank you for spending time with us. Thank you for all that you do in this community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate
Absolutely.
Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education or on our website.